Hello and welcome to the first ever LinkedIn Live in the Bankers for Net Zero Pavilion here in the Green Zone at Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27. I'm delighted to be joined by a couple of experts, and we're going to be speaking today about a common language for sustainability and ensuring that the whole market works together with that language. David Marriage is Head of Disruption and Innovation for Sustainability at PwC, and Rob Gardner is currently Director of Investments at St James's Place and a member of the board for Rewired.earth. Thank you both so much for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
First up, COP27, how are we finding it? Finance Day today?
Exciting. I mean, there's an awful lot going on. Obviously, there's the different zones, the government zone, business zone. The innovation zone is really interesting with all the new things that are coming out in the market, but also there are lots of side meetings, and often those side meetings really create the sort of the ideas and the sort of momentum, if you like, to move things forward. So I think it's exciting. And
Rob, getting about hasn't been too challenging?
Getting about has been interesting. You definitely need cash, so it's not cashless here. But a highlight for me is this is a COP in Africa, so there's a big focus on Africa. What does it mean for African nations? And the whole theme behind COP27 is one of action. So how can we move from talking about a 1.5 degree C world to actually let's get on, deploy some of that innovation, deploy the finance that was committed last year, and actually create some change.
We're going to be talking a bit about this common language as framework, but David, I wonder if you could set the scene for me. Why do you think that we need to think differently about ESG solutions and partnerships?
Well, I think the main reason is because increasingly people care about this stuff, and historically, as consumers we'd go to the market and we'd look for high quality product, low price when we're buying something, and as an investor we'd look for high return, low risk. But increasingly, as a consumer, we want to still have a high quality product and low price, but we want to save the planet and society when we're buying that product, and we might eat less meat or we might buy electric cars. So our demand is changing in the consumer world, but from an investor perspective, we also want high return, low risk while saving the planet and society. And the market really isn't ready to cope with that new demand. So it hasn't got the data required through the supply chains. It hasn't got the insight you require from the public in terms of creating a collective voice across the market. And so I think being able to join up the new demand signal in a clear way to create a strong market signal for the market, but then enabling the market to respond to that, to actually access the value pools that generates, means that profits go up as you do the right thing, values go up as you do the right thing. And that means long-term incentive plans kicking for directors as you do the right thing. And it's at that point the market becomes a force for good. So I think we're sort of at a tipping point, if you like, in terms of the way that market's being thought about. Still very similar models to the old world, but adding some new data points to essentially create a value case for sustainability.
Rob, David has there outlined the kind of clear case from a consumer and investor perspective, but how do we actually go about giving everyone a voice so we can drive that really clear demand signal?
Yeah, great question. I mean, as David said, I think key is having the same framework, the same approach, because it's consistency, and then it's ensuring that everyone has a voice, and that can be done through your workplace. So an easy way for most people to kind of answer that question, what do I care about, what do I care about least, is through your employer. But at the same time, many people belong to different organisations, and so the key is building awareness about creating a standardised framework, and then how do we get it out there. And a few of us actually published a link last week on LinkedIn, and so if you want to click and answer the question.
Yeah, we'll put that in the notes below.
Yeah, it takes 2 minutes, and rank what you care about the most and what you care about the least against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
And you're working closely with Rewired.earth. Can you tell us a bit about what designing that interconnected market solution looks like? I know they have something called Citizen Square.
Yeah, so that test that I was referring to earlier is trying to say, well, how do we think in an interconnected world? Just if I may sort of sidetrack, I mean, one of the things that's been called out already is why is it that we have a COP for climate change, and in a few weeks' time we have a COP for biodiversity in Montreal, when the two are inextricably linked, and actually you go on and go, really, foreign policy is climate policy, and climate policy is energy policy, and energy policy is agricultural policy and medicine, and they're all interlinked. So the truth is, the world is a kind of incredibly complicated operating system, and COP is really narrowly focused on one of the biggest issues, climate change. But we know to solve the problem, we need to think in a holistic way that kind of joins them all up and sort of ranks them. And so the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, if people aren't aware of them, are 17 goals really to help create a better planet for everyone on the planet. And the Citizen Square takes 16 of those, the 17th is about Partnership for Goals, and divides them up neatly into sort of 4 quadrants: stuff to do with the planet, climate change, life on land, life on water, stuff to do with people, poverty, stuff to do with prosperity, and stuff to do with principles of governance. And wouldn't it be great if we all knew where we ranked? And it's just been fascinating even taking the test myself and comparing it with friends and going, what matters to me? And wouldn't it be amazing to know how that data is different for males and females, for 25-year-olds, 35-year-olds, 45-year-olds, 55-year-olds, 65-year-olds? You were a politician, if you knew where the people who were voting for you, what they really cared about, and the nuance where you need to make the trade-offs between the two, and how do you stitch that together to create a narrative. And I think that is the fundamental problem. We've got politicians and leaders who don't really know the complexity of, I care about this, and then this, and then this, and how do I stitch a narrative to cut through? And at Rewired Earth, we're trying to make that happen.
And I know we've talked about this before offline around how leaders are now influenced by their constituents, by the electorate, and they're not leading from the front. How do you think that this will fit into that?
Well, exactly that. I mean, historically, there are 2 types of politician. A politician who says, let's go this way and take people with them. And, JFK might have been such a politician. There are fewer politicians these days. Most politicians are worried about getting elected in. So they want to know what the electorate think and then reflect that back. But very often that's done with very little data. Wouldn't it be amazing if you knew what every single eligible person to vote really thought about and cared about, and you could then design your policies against that, and you could trade them off. And then, as I said earlier, you could create that narrative that helps people understand why you've put these policies in place. Same could be said for leaders of businesses. So most of us will work in companies where there's some kind of pulse survey about your company. How's the company doing? Do you feel connected with the company? And there are lots of brilliant tools to do that. But wouldn't it be great if there was a standardized way? And what if we could compare a PwC to an SJP to a British Airways to an HSBC, and we had that kind of standard way of going, what do the people in our business care about? And when we run a graduate recruitment process, what do the graduates and the talent of tomorrow think versus the people who've been there 10 years?
And you imagine that for FTSE 250 as well as AIM across the board?
Well, I think the key thing is that as individuals we play different roles. So we're employees, we're citizens, as Rob was saying, we're investors, we're consumers, and across those roles we have similar values. We might hold ourselves to different levels of account, we might have a different level of voice. Everyone has one vote, but if you've got tens of millions of pounds versus a pound, in terms of the investment side, you may have different levels of influence, if you like, but actually everyone plays a role in all of those different elements of society. And so having a consistent language in terms of what I care about, I can share in lots of different ways across the market. But if then government, corporate world, investment houses, pensions, insurers, but also the charitable sector are able to take that consistent language and understand where the demand is and what people care about, it makes the whole thing a much more coherent end-to-end. And it enables the market essentially to, I suppose, value the values of the people participating in the market. At the moment, though, the value of the values is lost because all we really give is the signals I talked about at the beginning.
Are there any examples of common data languages that are already in existence that are working well?
Yes, I mean, the obvious one would be the financial data. If you think about 50 years ago, we all had our own ways of accounting things. We had Italian GAAP, French GAAP, UK GAAP, etc. But there was a realization that there was massive inconsistencies between the way that people accounted for revenue, for example. So the International Accounting Standards Board and then the IFRS Foundation created standards that, and except for the US mainly, covered the entire world. Now the US obviously and IFRS are becoming closer and closer together, and actually there is a level of consistency, so we know the numbers in there. But by having that standard data, if I'm an investment manager or a bank, I can create comparability across those different companies in different ways. So the there is models for this, in terms of standardization, and it actually reduces cost in the market. It simplifies the market. It means that decisions can be made on a fact base, as opposed to guesswork. I suppose if I can just add one last thought. If you think about the way that ESG is currently working, we're competing on the framework rather than having a framework that we compete around. And if you think about the equivalent in the financial data, it would be a bit like PwC saying, we love audit. But the issue that we've got is those costs in your P&L actually make your profitability actually a lot lower. So what we're going to do is we're just going to exclude costs. And that'll make you look excellent. And EY then say, well, that's good. I quite like what PwC did there. We're going to do that. But what we're also going to do is we're going to strip out liabilities, because we've noticed that liabilities make your balance sheet look bad. Now, the thing is, as the Big Four or anyone in the financial market started to compete on the framework, it's a bit of a race to the bottom. But also what you end up with is the banks go, well, I don't even know what's right here, so I'm going to start making up my own numbers. The asset managers have to do the same. We're just going to have our own models and work out what's going on. The corporates are crying out saying, look, we just want a consistent answer out here, guys, because you're not being able to compare apples and apples. That's essentially where we are with ESG. So this is about then, to your point, actually, there are instances where finance, in the finance case, in terms of where data has come together, but we need to do the same fidelity, integrity, reliability, consistency that the financial system has done for financial data in the non-financial data.
As my old boss, Mike Bloomberg, would say, it's all about the data. And, we loved data. They still do love data over at Bloomberg. And Bloomberg has got its Green Summit starting today. In terms of the data that Rewired Earth has already gathered, is there anything that you'd highlight that is particularly interesting?
I have to say, I'd go back to the data that we have about people who are clicking on the site and taking the test and just seeing what people care about the most. And then when you can look into the data and see how that varies by employer, by age group, it's fascinating. I think stuff that's coming out is either intuitive, people who've been working for 30 years think differently to people who just started their careers. But then, is less obvious. So again, having that nuance is key. And I'd really echo the point that David was saying. We need a standard framework, and then companies, politicians, individuals, whether they choose to work or whether they choose to shop as consumers, can apply their own judgment. That's always been the case. So this isn't trying to say there is a right or wrong answer. It's trying to say, let's have a standardized way that we can just compare things.
And we're here in partnership with Bankers for Net Zero, and I wondered if you could explain a little bit, David, about how Bankers for Net Zero fits into all of this.
Yeah, sure. So obviously Bankers for Net Zero is part of the sort of the constructs from COP26, set up by GFANZ and the Alliance, the Net Zero Banking Alliance. It's the UK country chapter of that construct, and what it's looking at is a number of the issues that the banks are facing around getting the transparency they need to understand their carbon footprint and their exposure to financed emissions. And one of the big areas of difficulty for the banks is actually getting real data for small and medium enterprises. And there's roughly just under 6 million small and medium enterprises in the UK. They make up about 50% of the carbon footprint. And so they're a critical element, if you like, of really understanding the UK's impact. But obviously the UK's impact goes broader into a wide range of supply chains that end up globally. So as a start, what we're trying to get to is a repeatable model within the SME world, which takes data from existing sources. So most SMEs, or pretty much all SMEs, have an accounting book of record. So something like a Sage or a QuickBooks or a Xero.
They've got to do their accounts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They often have a bank. And so as you start to look across the data sets that exist, being able to say, well, actually, there are some standard frameworks that we can take from the ledgers. There are loads of, there's a really effective tool that's being created and is continually growing called Engine B, which links into all of those different underlying ledgers. On top of that, essentially, we can create the standard model that Rob was talking about, which is we're not going to overcomplicate this because everybody needs to buy in. So what's the 1 to 4 things that if we measure them consistently globally through the supply chain will move the needle? And the clue's in the name in terms of Bankers for Net Zero. Obviously, this is more of a carbon focus. So if you think about the relationship to the Rewired Earth Square, if you like, this is very much in climate action. And within climate action, it's creating the transparency of impact. So it's looking through the supply chain, but doing that in an automated way that does two things. Firstly, means there's a low barrier of entry to the SMEs to step in. They don't really have to think. Most SMEs are just trying to keep their head above the water, pay the bills, pay the staff, make sure they're making hopefully a profit. But it also gives the that sort of transparency, if you like, of business case. I've got demand. I now understand actually through my supply chain, this SME, I need them to do something around climate action. And if they do that thing around climate action, my square becomes more green, I access better custom capital and debt. So it's also about building the value case as part of Bankers for Net Zero. So I can step in easily, and if I step in, I'm increasing the value of my organisation. And so that's why this piece is critical, because it actually is a real building block to then sort of broaden that out across the rest of the square.
This is about implementation, this COP, and you've explained the case for implementation from your perspective. Now, what happens next? COP, you know, we're having all these discussions now. Tell me a little bit about what happens next on the ground here, but also pushing into COP28. What are the ambitions and hopes for this? To you, Rob, first.
So focusing on COP, I mean, we're still at the beginning, so it's a 2-week process, right? And there are lots of government officials and all the entourage that goes with that, lots of sidebar conversations. And the killer question is who's paying for it, right? That's...
Yeah. You know, and that was put on the agenda on day one, loss and damage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, well, that's a part of who pays for it. That's the past. There's also sort of who pays for the future and who benefits for the future. As David said, we've got the innovation zone. We had an innovation zone last year at COP26, so we know the technology's here. There were some brilliant examples around the world. We just need to scale it and make it happen. And that's why having Finance Day, which was really new last year, is so important. You know, how can we scale and implement this? And so if this is about action, next year, which is in the UAE, it's all about demonstrating, well, what has actually happened. Let's showcase, and we need to accelerate fast. I mean, we said earlier on the podcast about how we need to get global emissions down from 50 gigatons a day. We need to halve that by 2030. To put that in context, during 2020 in COVID, global emissions fell by 7%. The next year in 2021, they went up by 5%. So we need to be really getting on with that sort of 7% reduction every year for the rest of this decade. So, you know, output from the end of this week and next week is really how do we get on and make this happen? And then COP28 is where's the accountability and, you know, where we're going to shine a light on what's working and where we're going to call out what's not working.
David, from your point of view?
No, I totally agree with Rob. I think the other bit that it would be great to see is in basically introducing and injecting the voice of the public into the conversation. Because as Rob was saying at the beginning, actually having that clarity of support actually from the public is a massive game changer for especially democracies. Because within democracies you have a balance between how much can you get away with in terms of pushing the needle, making the changes, changing people's lives, which this will require, and still get voted in the next election. Yeah. And at the moment there's a disconnect between the level of care in society, which I think is rapidly increasing as we see houses burn down in London from climate change, massive floods in Germany, etc. You know, there are huge impacts across the world. Pakistan's another terrible example of the impacts of climate change. And so as we see those things, we care and we want to make a difference. But at the moment, we don't feel we've got a voice. Now, if we can use the voice, like, Rewired Earth is an example of this, but creating a voice that can be shared with governments creates the mandate for governments to act faster, and we don't therefore need to wait for regulation because the business case exists. And at the moment, boards essentially see sustainability at one end, value at the other. And sustainability is some sort of regulatory burden, some sort of philanthropic action, and overhead, which is always in direct antithesis to value. But if you can bring value and sustainability together, i.e. by doing the right thing, I get more value, I get paid more, and I get more profit, the market becomes a force for good. And as the market becomes a force for good, we stand a fighting chance of dealing with the issues that Rob raised just now.
Okay, I feel pretty optimistic. I'm going to end it there. Thank you both very much, David Marriage, Rob Gardner, for joining us today on this LinkedIn Live on David's LinkedIn channel. For those who are watching it afterwards, please do go below. You'll see a link which will take you to the Rewired.earth survey that you can fill out. We're really grateful to you for doing that, because as David was saying, if we use the voice of the public, we can be the catalyst for change. So thank you for that. Rob also mentioned the podcast. The Bankers for Net Zero podcast, which is Talking COP with Rob Gardner, is out later today. So keep looking on all the LinkedIn channels and various socials for that. Just leaves me to say thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for tuning in, and do follow us on LinkedIn, Bankers for Net Zero, to find out more.